Ismische Kevin Makrian, False Rash Gan Nematon. The most obvious correlation between the tradition of the Rigveda and Celtic myth is the goddess Danu. Danu in Celtic myth is the progenitor goddess of the gods, the Tuatha Danann. Although not much is said about her, we can determine that she was in fact a goddess of the primal waters based on the meaning of her name. Her name means to flow, and in the Avestan, in fact, Danu means river. And there are many rivers in Europe named after Danu. But it wouldn't be correct to assume that the goddess is some sort of river goddess writ large. Rather, she is the flowing cosmic waters. This bowing may be a kind of reflection of Danu, or even Danu under another name. But it's hard to say. Interestingly, however, in the Vedic tradition, Danu is seen as an asura, which generally is a deity classification that generally has a negative aspect to it. And indeed, she is presented as the mother of Vrtra and the Danavas, which are a negative classification of deities. They are obstructors and figures that the gods have to overcome. Most famous, of course, is Vrtra, which Indra has to slay with his thunderbolt because he is withholding the waters. So the Vedic tradition preserves the memory of the goddess Danu in a sort of reversed way from the Celtic tradition, where she is not the mother of the gods, but in fact the mother of the opposing forces, the forces that must be overcome, that are problematic, that are chaotic. But the name of the goddess and the fact that she's related to water in some way is still preserved there. However, the chief goddess in the Vedic tradition is Aditi, and her name means something like limitless or boundless. I have heard it argued that she is an earth goddess. I have heard it argued that she is a celestial or solar goddess. There is no clear conception or agreed upon idea about exactly what this goddess represents, but to me, it's easiest just to think that she represents exactly what her name means. But she does seem to be related in some way to the light and the sun, as are all of her children. In the Celtic tradition, of course, we have the gods called the Tuatha Danann, but in fact all of their genealogy, or most of the major deities' genealogy, going back to a goddess instead called Enya. Now I've heard it argued that Enya is really Bowen, and Bowen is really Danu. It's possible, but these are all conjectures, because it's also possible that at some point the goddess of the primal waters was supplanted by a goddess of primal fires or potentiality, as also may have happened in the Vedic tradition with Danu supplanted by Aditi, but then subsequently turned into a figure of opposition. Another possibility, of course, is that Danu is simply the mother goddess of a neighboring but hostile tribal group to those who would go on to write the Rigveda, and thus they simply used the name of the mother goddess of their enemies to be the enemy of their gods. But nonetheless, since they're in the same sort of cultural and linguistic milieu, they preserve this sort of same identity and same concepts and ideas of the gods, but simply give them different names. And in this way, Aditi might be exactly the same as Danu, but simply their own tribal version of that. In the Vedic tradition, Danu's son, Vrtra, is represented as being a dragon. And some people speculate that he was meant to represent the clouds that were not giving forth rain, and thus the thunderbolt of Indra that smote the clouds broke them open and showered down upon the earth. So although an obstructor, Vrtra is still associated with the waters. He's also presented as a calf, and his mother, Danu, as a cow. In that when Indra slays him, and in fact slays them both, that his thunderbolt passes through Vrtra and into Danu, and kills them both, it is said that the calf laid down with the cow. This is significant, of course, because bowing also means cow, and also refers to the Milky Way. And the Milky Way is also linked to Lugh and Gwydion, and, at least argued by some, is linked to Varuna in the Vedic tradition, as viewed as the sky pillar, or in fact the tree that grows through the sky. So the bowing on Earth is in some way a reflection of the cosmic waters, the cosmic river. And cattle are often associated with the waters, like the story about Hermes stealing the cattle, for instance, and becoming the cattle god. Well, he's really becoming, in one sense, he is becoming the literal cattle god. In another sense, he is becoming the herder of the clouds. And that's why he's always associated together with Zeus as his messenger, because he is in fact assembling the clouds for Zeus. And the milk of the cows is the water that rains down upon the land. Now, Enya's other name is cited to be her true name, was said to be Feda, which to me seems to be derived ultimately from fid, meaning wood. For instance, wild vines in Old Irish are called fiedana. In modern Gaelic, this is fiag. So in fact, Lugh mac Enya can be read as Lugh, son of the wood, or the tree, in this case meaning specifically the world tree. And thus Enya's name probably doesn't really refer to fire as much as it does the idea of kernel or seed. Thus it also puts into perspective Lugh's protectiveness of agriculture, and also poems like The Battle of the Trees, as Lugh is specifically born of the tree. Now, the confusing part is that in various sources, so are all of the other gods. But this is made exclusively important to Lugh, as it certainly isn't to any of the others. Now, ultimately, of course, what feeds it or sustains any tree, right? Whether it's a real tree or a cosmic tree, it is the waters. And so it really does come back again to Danu as being the sustainer in many ways of the material reality. The material reality in which the Tuatha Dé Danann strive to uphold and defend. Consequently, something I just thought of just now is that how Beli and Dawn are said to be the progenitor deities in the Welsh tradition. This might in fact relate to Balor being an epitome of procreation, which he seems to be made out to be in the Second Battle of Moytura, and we'll do another video on that. And Danu being the source of the cosmic waters. Anyway, there's a lot that is at play here, and a lot of different symbols are used in Celtic myth to express the same thing. So it can get a little bit confusing, especially since this was all recorded in a Christian time when this stuff really wasn't believed anymore as a religion. And so some of our facts are a bit confused as well. But I'll run through a few things for you to consider. Lugh is associated with water, trees, agriculture, as well as light, and the dawn. Danu is, presumably anyway, the goddess of the primordial waters. Lugh is presented as having a hostile relationship with the traditional thunder and lightning deities, who often represent fire due to lightning being a representation of fire, or a manifestation of fire. Lugh also has bad relations, shall we say, with deities like the Dagda and his children, who in many different respects also embody the idea of fire, and Ogma himself may be a fire deity, the equivalent of Agni. Lugh gets a special spear by commanding the sons of Turin, that is, the thunder god, Taranas. He forces them to in fact acquire his spear, in other words, his lightning bolt. So at least one of the stories about a spear related to Lugh is he gets it from the lightning god, which is, however, in contrast to other Indo-European myths, like Slavic myth that has the thunder god repeatedly beating down on a god like Veles, I think his name is, who is in some way associated with the waters, plants, and the underworld. So you could argue, I don't know if I will argue, but you could argue that Lugh, in fact, is a representation of exactly the opposite thing happening. Where instead of, the dragon god, son of Danu, as representing the obstructor, who must be overcome by the god Indra, who wields the lightning. In Lugh's case, it is the god of contract and binding and oath, the same aspects carried by Varuna, or Mitra, who through his intelligence supplants the thunder god and rules through sort of magic and wisdom, his mastery of all of the skills. This also seems to correspond with a similar trend that happens in the Aryan religion of the Persians, where the gods that are labeled the Asuras in the Vedic tradition become the highest gods, and the Devas, gods like Indra, for instance, become the demonic forces. So in the Vedic tradition, Mitra and Apam-Napat, who may be a continuation of Varuna because his name means something like grandson or progeny of the waters. And he is cited as the creator of all things. He doesn't really have a whole lot of importance by the time you get to the Avestan, but he's still there as one of the triad, along with Mithra, who's also associated with waters, and Ahura Mazda. Now, it seems that Ahura Mazda actually took over a lot of the role that Apam-Napat had originally, because originally Apam-Napat was the creator deity. Thus, there was still the idea that everything, in fact, is created with water as the base. But Apam-Napat himself is a fire deity. How can this be? Because it's the fire from the water. So he emerges from the water, it says, clothed in lightning. Just as, lightning appears only in water. So water is the source of fire in the traditional Indo-European understanding. So within water, there is fire. But that also makes water the very basis of material reality. And it means that you can't conceive of the cosmos as being created out of fire or out of a fiery principle. It must be out of a watery principle from which emerges the fire. And that primordial principle is encapsulated by Danu. And so one of the reasons we don't have myths about Danu is because she's so primordial and so significant in a cosmological sense that there's no way to craft a myth around this. Right? Myths are not the gods, right? Myths are just a way of trying to explain the gods. The best way to explain Danu is simply as mother of the gods. And that even includes the fiery gods, because ultimately all the fire is thought to originate from the water. And that water is also then conceived of as the underworld. Lugh threatens Balor and then says he will consign him beneath the waves. In another myth, Lugh confines a chaotic deity beneath the earth.
beneath the roots of strong oak trees, beneath the earth, beneath the waves, beneath. This is reference to the other world. Of course, water always gathers in low places. Offerings were made by the Celts into water because of this reason, because beneath the surface of the water is the underworld, metaphysically speaking. Now, the underworld was not conceived of as an evil place, but it was the realm where the chaotic powers, the sort of progenitor powers, originate from. And those powers must be used, controlled, and harnessed by the gods of skill and craft, as the Tuatha are described as being. But as a liminal god, you could say, Lugh has to guard the boundaries to ensure that chaos doesn't seep up into the world and begin to negatively affect things, such as the crops. And of course, he ensures the water for the trees and so on in a physical sense. Anyway, this is why gods associated with water are so important in the Celtic tradition. Gods like Nuada, gods like Manannan, and gods like Lugh are all associated with the waters and are of primary importance, because ultimately those waters were conceived of as the generator of all things. And the gods who governed and maintained those waters were therefore closest to Danu. Anyhow, this is just the first of a series of videos that I'm going to be doing on topics relating Celtic myth to Vedic tradition and ancient Persian tradition. Because out of all of the material that I have read from an Indo-European background, these are the two sources that are the closest to Celtic myth. And it also corresponds to what ancient writers said about the Druids, which is that they were close parallels to what was found in the East. I'd like to thank my Patreon subscribers. It helps me continue this research and work towards establishing a sanctuary with lands and so on that we can all utilize in the future. Tapalev ersan echtak agus marsavisht shes ard.